This is fine.
So here's a little fun fact for you all. I've never actually used a Sega Genesis before. My childhood was spent in the 2000s, during the GameCube and Wii eras, and growing up, my primary exposure to the 16-bit era was through my grandmother's Super Nintendo, while my first experiences with Sega's consoles were through the Dreamcast and the Master System, both of which still being the only Sega consoles I've ever had a chance to use. I didn't really know what a Genesis was until I got a copy of Sonic Mega Collection in 2006, I believe? On that note though, I was lucky that the 2000s marked Sega's start in going crazy with re-releasing Genesis games, whether that be through compilations like the previously mentioned Mega Collection and the more recent Genesis Classics Collection, or through individual releases via Virtual Console on the Wii Shop channel. Say what you will about Sega versus Nintendo, but when it comes to making their older titles accessible in the modern day, Sega definitely does an overall better job at it than Nintendo. Dare I say, Sega does what Nintendo don't. Come on, you knew I had to do it. But either way, it was through these re-releases that I got to experience several Sega titles I would have otherwise never gotten a chance to play. From the classic 2D Sonic games, to the Phantasy Star games pre-Phantasy Star Online, to stranger cult classics like Vector Man 1 and 2, and those are just scratching the surface. Though among all these Genesis games I was getting a chance to try out on everything other than the Genesis itself, one in particular really stuck out to me. This one game about a little spherical star-faced fellow named Ristar. I can't say I quite remember what first brought Ristar to my attention, but it clearly had to be an effective means, because I do remember it being the first Virtual Console game I ever bought off the Wii Shop channel, back in 2008. Heck, I think it was my first Wii Shop channel purchase period, only to then find out that it was one of the unlockable games on Mega Collection, and despite having already paid money to have it on the Wii, I went through the process of unlocking it in Mega Collection, which for context, you had to boot up all the other unlockable games 30 times each to do so, but to get all the other unlockable games, you had to boot up all the starting games 20 times each. Don't know how I had the patience to do that whole process, but with that, I now had 2 versions of this game. Seriously, whatever introduced me to Ristar clearly had to be a really effective means. And I mean, hey, I ended up loving the game, so I guess it was worth it in the end. Seriously, it was easily the game in Mega Collection I put the most time into, far more than the 2D Sonic games. Though, it's been quite some time since I last played through this game, so I felt it'd be fun to do so for the sake of a video. Give myself an excuse to talk about this obscure Genesis game to a bunch of people on the internet. To quickly go over the history of the game itself, Ristar was developed in-house by Sega. In fact, if you want to be technical, it was the first Sonic Team game that wasn't a Sonic game. Now yes, at the time, the dev team wasn't attached to Sonic Team, but given the same dev team's next game, Nights into Dreams, was given the Sonic Team label, a lot of people tend to refer to Ristar as a Sonic Team title, and I too shall make that same stretch. It's funny because that's what Ristar do. Ristar was actually an idea first conceived in 1990, as one of the proposed concepts for what would become Sonic the Hedgehog. At the time, he was supposed to be a rabbit who would extend his ears to grab stuff, but the idea was scrapped. Sometime later though, the idea was revived via a prototype, though instead of using extendable ears, it was extendable arms. Hey, wait a minute. It was through this prototype that Ristar was born, which went on to come out in January 1995 in Europe and in February 1995 everywhere else. Unfortunately, despite positive reviews at the time of its launch, there was one problem with Ristar that prevented it from becoming a success. A Sega Saturn-shaped problem, to be more specific. The Sega Saturn had already been out in Japan for 2 months, and its notorious E3 shadow drop in North America occurred just 3 months after Ristar came out. All eyes were on the Saturn and the next generation of gaming in general, so Ristar didn't stand a chance commercially. Though thanks to its various re-releases it got, starting with Sonic Mega Collection, it started to gain the small cult following it has nowadays, and is often considered an underappreciated Genesis gem of sorts. Which I personally agree with, but how's about we go into the why on that now? Oh, and to those curious, I'm playing the game via the Genesis Classics Collection on Steam, which, quick side note, you should all get the Genesis Classics Collection. Wide variety of Genesis titles, but also a really cozy atmosphere with the menus and environment, giving that old school feeling of playing Genesis games. You can even set the game to appear as if you were playing on a CRT TV, it's great. But anyway, let's talk about Ristar now. The game takes place in a far-off galaxy known as the Valdi system, which has recently been invaded and taken over by an evil space pirate. Said evil space pirate is named Kaiser Greedy, a name that's both utterly silly and utterly cool. Like, just say it out loud. Kaiser Greedy. I don't know how they managed to make a single name simultaneously feel like a Saturday morning cartoon villain and a genuinely threatening tyrant at the same time, but I love it. But yeah, Kaiser Greedy has enslaved the various planets of the Valdi system, and has taken control over each planet's leader. And in their last moment of freedom, the residents of planet Flora send out a call for help. Now what's interesting is that, in the different regional releases, Ristar's identity and ties to the conflict are quite different. In the Japanese version, the call for help is received by a star goddess of sorts named Oruto, with Ristar being her child that she awakens to grant the wishes of the Valdi system. While in the North American version, Oruto is nowhere to be seen, and the game's opening mentions how a legendary hero was taken captive by Kaiser Greedy, and that Ristar is said hero's son. Not entirely sure why this change was made, but it will actually come into play later on, though we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. This also isn't the last time you'll hear about regional differences on that note. Either way though, the quest in both versions is the same. Ristar's gotta travel from planet to planet, freeing the people from Kaiser Greedy's forces, before taking on Kaiser Greedy himself to save the Valdi system. Pretty straightforward stuff, so let's mosey! As was quite common with cutesy, cartoony character games back in the day, Ristar is a 2D platformer. So despite his design and expression making him look like he'd be ready for a fight, the game leans more into the puzzle platformer side of things, rather than the more actiony style that was becoming more common at the time, like with Sonic. In fact, physics-wise, Ristar is practically the polar opposite of Sonic, with slower movement and heavier jumping. Granted, the game's built around these physics, so it's definitely not an issue, but if you're going into Ristar expecting something like Sonic, that's definitely not where you're gonna get. Control-wise, Ristar keeps it extremely simple, with only 2 inputs beyond movement: jumping, and, most notably, grabbing. Ristar is able to stretch his arms out to grab most things in the game, and depending on what he's grabbing, he'll either pull it back to him, such as with items he can carry, or pull himself to it, such as with treasure chests, grabbable parts of the environment, or enemies. This grab mechanic is the primary core to Ristar's gameplay, arguably more so than even jumping. Most of the game is designed around this mechanic, and mastery of it is key to succeeding, especially as the game progresses and gets harder. And with the various ways the grab can be used, the skill ceiling can get quite high. For one, Ristar can stretch his arms in 8 different directions, allowing for a lot of options when it comes both to maneuvering and taking out enemies. Sure, you could wait for this bird enemy to charge at you to attack it, or you could grab onto it while it's in the air and slam into it from there, or even just hang on to it and swing yourself back and forth, an ability that does come in handy at several points throughout the game. Heck, I've personally gotten used to using the grab at a diagonal angle to cheese my way to parts of the level I wasn't supposed to get to yet. Take for example, this puzzle here. You're supposed to jump across these floating bubbles to get to the floating platform with the treasure chest. My way of doing it? See? I can be good at video games sometimes. One of my favorite things to do with the grab though, taking hold of enemies and then just holding them in place before you let go of the button to do the attack. The enemy sprites often spaz out when you do this, and it tends to be pretty funny. And hey, it actually serves a functional purpose at the end of the game, but we'll get there when we get there. That said, there is one more core gameplay mechanic that revolves around the grabbing, and coincidentally, it actually has to do with revolving. Throughout the game are these star handles, and when you grab onto them, you'll start spinning around them so long as you're holding on. However, if you continue holding the direction you're spinning towards, you can build up more speed, and once fast enough, you'll release a meteor strike when you let go. This allows you to launch off and fly around in any direction, completely invincible in this state, until you run out of momentum and fall back down. However, you can keep the momentum going by bouncing off surfaces while in the meteor strike state. More often than not, areas with star handles will have some kind of hidden goodie that can only be reached with the meteor strike, whether that be health, extra lives, gems for extra points, or a path to a hidden bonus stage. So the sooner you get used to using it, the better. Plus, it is pretty satisfying to enter full shooting star mode and basically destroy anything and everything in your way. And hey, if you find some treasures in the process, even better. As I said earlier, the game is entirely built around the grabbing ability, and puts it to its fullest all throughout the game. It can take some time to get used to some of its intricacies, especially with the meteor strike, but it's really fun to move around the environment with Ristar. It can often feel like a sandbox full of ways to get from here to there, and with the more open nature of some of the levels, this is definitely encouraged at many points throughout the game. Ristar is a linear platformer, with the main goal of each level being to get to the star handle at the end and swinging your way off screen, with your height determining your bonus. Think the Martyr flagpole. But many levels are multi-route, allowing for you to get through them the way you so wish. Some do get more straightforward, but even when they do, they remain fun to traverse and overcome. And each set of levels tend to bring their own unique tricks for you to deal with. The Planet Flora levels do keep it simple, as, well, opening levels. Its mini-boss is pretty neat though. But then Planet Undertow rolls around, and you now apply everything you've learned in water-filled environments. The game does have underwater sections, but quite fortunately, with full 8-direction movement and the same level of speed as walking, not a whole lot changes mechanically. In fact, now the grab also serves as a front stroke, allowing you to burst forward. so any abilities you lose under the water are balanced out with new handy ones. Undertow's levels also has rising and lowering waters, these weird face things that infinitely spawn enemies until you destroy them, these rooms where you defeat a bunch of squids before fighting a giant squid, and the previously mentioned bubble platforms. So it doesn't take long for things to start getting tricky. Also, the mini-boss this time is literal waves of enemies. I love it. Though speaking of tricky, enter World 3, Planet Scorch. This is where I'd say the first difficulty jump kicks in, as Scorch's levels can definitely get quite a bit harder than the previous worlds, while not being NES hard or anything in my opinion. The game's level design and obstacles get a fair bit more creative here as well, with fire geyser traps that you're able to activate or deactivate manually, enemies setting off fire explosives that completely change the environment, though if you kill the enemy before he sets off the bomb, the environment will remain unchanged, and most notable of all, traps that you can set off by throwing mini Ristar statues at them instead of stepping on them yourself. And the statue takes it all with a smile on its face. What a trooper. Though the mini-boss here is a game of memory / Simon Says. Just kinda there if you ask me. This brings us to World 4, Planet Sonata, one of my personal favorites in the game. The planet's aesthetic is entirely musically themed, with drum platforms that send you bouncing upwards, dancing guitar enemies that only move and attack when you're on the ground that activates them, and a level-long puzzle where you carry metronomes through puzzling obstacle courses to get them to the planet's songbird residence. What I really like about this last example is that, when the level starts, the music has a very simple electronic melody, but with each songbird that gets a metronome, a chunk of the song will change, until you have a completely different song by the end of the level. It's a really great and really fitting touch for a world themed around music. That said, the mini-boss of this world is kinda eh. The idea's neat, with these 3 bird statues being orchestrated to strike down during the main part of a song, but with very little visual cue to when they'll attack, this part can get trickier than it needs to be. Though apparently the Japanese version of this fight did actually give clearer visual cues. Not entirely sure why they got rid of that in the North American version. World 5 is probably my favorite in the game, which is weird because I often don't care for levels with ice physics, but leave it to Planet Freon to be an exception to the rule. With its really pleasant atmosphere between its snowy environment in the first level and its crystal-coated waters in the second level, and ice physics that are actually really cleverly implemented. Instead of doing the usual, you move normally but have zero traction thing that platformers do with ice physics, Ristar instead has you automatically sliding forward, using your momentum to jump to where you need to go, whether that be off the ice or onto another sheet of ice to keep the momentum going. It gets especially fun in the second level with this section here. Seriously, Ristar made ice physics fun! And it's also got a great mini-boss where you fight a Freonian resident in a snowball fight. Can this game do no wrong? Ristar is certainly not an easy game, but up to this point, I wouldn't say it ever feels too excruciating difficulty-wise, aside from one part that I'll go into later. But then in comes Planet Automaton, where the difficulty goes from difficult to help me! The first level of the world is such a sudden difficulty spike that, based on what I've read, lots of people tend to get stuck here when playing the game. And yeah, I can see why. The level's filled with really tricky obstacles, such as this maze of bars that'll activate and deactivate whenever you use your grab, but with some going on when some go off, and some that don't move at all, it can mess with your head quite a bit. And it's full of some of the most annoying enemies in the game, whether it be they have small weak spots that they often keep hidden, shoot out tons of projectiles, or move faster than you can react. And that's all before mentioning the mini-boss. To give you an idea of how hard this one is, when I first got to it, I had 11 lives. By the time I beat it, I was down to 6. And it shouldn't even be that hard in concept. It's just a bunch of the most basic enemies taking different attack forms that require you to hit the core to move on. But for some reason, the hitboxes on these enemies are awkwardly janky, often resulting in either the enemy not taking damage when it should, or you taking damage by the smallest of pixels, or both. Needless to say, wasn't a fan of this whatsoever. The oddest thing though, is that right after easily the hardest level in the game, is one of the easiest levels in the game. Now granted, it is a pretty cool level. You get taken through various trial rooms of sorts, each with their own contained puzzles, from maneuvering with the meteor strike, to altering the movement pattern of floating platforms with your grab, to going through the background with the foreground serving as visual cues to what's in the background that you can't see. It's a fun level, but yeah, it's notably easier than the level before. Don't know what exactly happened with the difficulty curve there, to be honest. There is one more level after that, but it's more so just an appetizer before the game's last few bosses, so it's not really of note in my opinion. Actually, on that note, let's talk about the bosses themselves. Each first level of a world ends with a mini-boss, as I've already gone over, but after each second level, there's a full-on boss fight, and these definitely range in quality. For instance, Flora's boss fight, Riho, is pretty unremarkable. You just attack the Floran Elder a few times while Riho's attached onto his back, and then hit Riho once he's fallen off. Do this 3 times and the fight's over. Though it is the first boss, so I can let the easy factor slide. And fortunately, Undertow's boss, Osat, does step it up a bit more. You fight him underwater, with the water lowering after each attack and thus limiting your movement space. And Osat's attacks tend to be either fast or take up a fair bit of the area, so he's certainly more of a challenge than Riho. I remember not really caring for this fight before, but honestly, he's pretty fun. For Scorch, you fight an armadillo-looking creature named Adahan, and I do quite like this one as well. Sure, it can be pretty easy, so long as you remember that he always digs out of the ground from the middle of the arena, but the interlude between phases does give the fight a unique edge, as you fall down a shaft and have to land a blow on Adahan in mid-air. I did call this one my favorite of the regular bosses long ago, and yeah, I still like it. On the flip side, I've previously called Sonata's boss, Awauwek, my least favorite boss in the game, and yep, that still stands. This is that one exception to the fair difficulty I brought up earlier, because man, Awauwek can be brutal. There's his dive attacks, and his slamming, and his dropping of feathers, but in particular, when he's on the music stand, his musical notes and the way they fly towards you are random, and depending on which he does when, they can be annoying to deal with. And that's also before mentioning the falling debris from the ceiling that can hurt you, which in the hecticness of it all can often be hard to notice. The game's manual notes as one of its hints that patience is key when playing Ristar, and this boss is definitely where that applies most. Only when I was willing to back up and take my time to avoid the music notes was I able to beat Awauwek a fair bit more easily. Still not a fun boss fight though. Fortunately, Freon's boss, Edomore, is quite a step up. Instead of attacking him directly, you damage Edomore by feeding him hot food provided by the Freonian you fought in the snowball fight earlier. It's kind of like that one boss from DKC 3, only better because you're melting an ice monster with hot food, as opposed to feeding bugs to a giant living barrel. DKC 3 was weird. Interestingly though, in the Japanese version, Edomore was actually a giant cat as opposed to an ice monster. But the reason behind the change does make sense in this case. The boss being a cat was a reference to a Japanese metaphor that translates to cat tongue, referring to someone who doesn't like hot food. Such a metaphor doesn't exist in North America though, so Edomore got redesigned to being an ice monster that you're melting with the hot food, which hey, still works. Automaton's boss fight brings us to the first of Kaiser Greedy's main cronies, a battle robot known as Uranum. This one's honestly pretty easy. Just keep going to town on him with attacks in the air and he'll pretty much never be able to hurt you. And just be sure to back up and start grabbing your way up the wall once he starts charging his laser shot. I do like how you do damage to him though. Once you hit him enough times to knock him out, Kaiser Greedy's other crony, Inonis, will try to attack you with his robot claw, and you gotta trick him into hitting Uranum. Pretty alright fight. Though Uranum taking shots at you before you even enter the boss room can be irritating if you're not prepared. Speaking of Inonis, he is the boss awaiting you after the appetizer section I mentioned earlier. And like with Uranum, you kinda just wail away at him with attacks from the air until he dies. Though you do need to be wary of his boomerang, and time your air attack when he's charging his ray gun to ensure you go over the shot. Though after you beat Inonis, you make your way right to the final boss, Kaiser Greedy himself. Let's start with the obvious thing about this fight. It is hard. The fight's 3 phases long, and with each phase it only gets trickier and trickier, with faster and more aggressive attacks. And by the final phase, you're dealing with lightning blasts and a freaking insta-kill black hole. This is where that enemy holding mechanic I mentioned earlier comes into use, but you better hope an enemy doesn't spawn right above you when doing this, because that can screw you over. I actually did a run before my footage recording one to refresh my memory on the game, and during that run, I got not 1, but 2 game overs on this fight alone. Though, having said that, I love this fight. Don't get me wrong, it's really hard. But unlike with Awauwek, I'm not feeling annoyed whenever I lose. It's a very satisfying kind of hard. One that makes you want to go at it again when you lose, and makes you feel great when you finally triumph. And that's before mentioning the icing on the cake, Kaiser Greedy himself. This may be his first appearance in the game since the opening, but through this fight alone, you get an absolutely clear picture painted of who he is and how he feels about you, just through his animations and stances. During the first phase, he's very casually seated on his throne, and throws in other enemies to deal with you while he merely watches. Second phase, he gets up and starts flying around, but keeps himself covered up with his cape and with little effort put into his attacks. But by the third phase, he's no longer got himself covered up, and he's bombarding you with his strongest attacks. At this point, he sees you as a threat, and wants to make sure you die. It's pretty incredible how much they're able to communicate about his character without so much as a single line of dialogue, especially for a 16-bit 2D platformer. Now on top of all that, there is one final gameplay bit I've yet to go over. Earlier I mentioned the existence of hidden bonus stages, which yep, every level has one. And when I mean hidden, I really mean it. They're often quite well tucked away within the levels, requiring a keen eye and good maneuvering to find them. And that's just the process of getting to them. The actual bonus stages themselves have you get to a treasure within 60 seconds, but no two bonus stages are quite the same. Some will have you using star handles to meteor strike your way to the treasure in time, but one you'll have to navigate an ice physics-based maze, or climb your way around while avoiding touching spikes, or this puzzle that requires you to find a way to the top using these treasure chests, or even using my cheesing tactic to edge jump from platform to platform. These challenges can get both quite creative and, well, quite challenging. But my one issue is that, should you fail the bonus stage, you're locked out of it until you get a game over. Because of that, I admittedly did resort to Genesis Classic's save state feature for 2 of the bonus stages. By collecting treasures, you get secret cheat codes unveiled to you at the end of the game after the credits roll. And sure, this isn't as much of an incentive nowadays with the ability to, well, look them up online, but it is still a cool reward. And it is satisfying watching all the treasures show up on that screen. Also, one of the cheat codes unlocks a level select, and the cheat code in question to do so is I love you. That's adorable. Now let's move on to the technical stuff. Though this time I want to go over the audio first, as there's something I want to go into further with the visuals. But anyway, the music. Ooh boy. Now speaking generally, I do prefer the sound fonts of the Super Nintendo over the Genesis, but I definitely won't deny that the Genesis was capable of some fantastic sounding music, and in my opinion, Ristar is a prime example of this. Seriously, I love this soundtrack. It does an amazing job at perfectly communicating the feel of each environment or scenario, all while continuously providing incredibly catchy tunes. Some personal favorites include Flora's first level, Undertow's second level, Scorch's first level, and probably my favorite of the level themes, Freon's second level. And that's before mentioning songs beyond the level themes, such as the standard boss theme, Kaiser Greedy's boss theme, and both of the credits songs. Actually, on the topic of Kaiser Greedy's theme, something I love about it is how it's intentionally paced so that the player will likely be starting the third phase by the time the song's gotten to its most intense part. Ristar's composer, Tomoko Sasaki, actually went on to co-compose both of the Knights games, and you can definitely feel that same sort of energy in this OST. Seriously, I highly recommend giving the game's soundtrack a listen, it's really good. Now to talk about visuals, which overall are quite lovely. The environments are vibrant and colorful, and the characters all have distinct, memorable designs that stand out well in the levels. But I wanted to bring special attention to a specific part of the visuals: the backgrounds. Seriously, these are gorgeous. Just as vibrantly colorful as the main environments, and many of which having extra animated details that provide so much more life to the levels, even if you may not notice it. The Genesis was capable of some truly stunning stuff, and it really shows in Ristar's case. Though speaking of which, how's about we talk about the little guy himself on a visual standpoint? A pretty noticeable change made to the game for the localization was to Ristar himself, going through what I lovingly call North American Kirby syndrome. Yep, his cheerful expression has been replaced with a more stern, serious look. Now I imagine this was an attempt to make Ristar seem cooler to North American audiences, as we North Americans clearly don't like cutesy stuff. But through this decision, I've actually made a bit of a headcanon regarding Ristar. See, while his main idle animations have more serious looks, his other animations remain unaltered. So it's led me to believe that Ristar's choice of expressions come down to the fact that he is, indeed, baby. He puts on this overly serious face because he's gotta be the hero, and heroes are serious. But the moment he has an opportunity to just be himself, he's a happy being. For instance, in Sonata, if you stay idle for long enough, he starts singing along to the music, toe tapping and all. Or in Freon, if you stand on snowy ground for long enough, he makes himself a little snowman. See, he's a precious little star child. And in fact, the game's ending actually supports this headcanon of mine. Or more specifically, the North American ending. See, after you beat Kaiser Greedy, a wormhole forms and sucks in Greedy, Uranium, and Ionis before completely tearing apart Greedy's empire, with Ristar escaping just in time. And across the credits, we see artwork of peace returning to the planets now that Kaiser Greedy's gone. However, the ending scene players get at the end of the credits, and before the cheat code screen, was changed for the North American version. In the Japanese version, we see Kaiser Greedy and his cronies in a rocky terrain, just kinda looking off into deep space. However, in the North American version, we get this cute reunion between Ristar and his father, and just look at that smile. Even taking the headcanon out of the question, I do honestly prefer the North American ending. I personally prefer having the fate of Greedy and his troops more ambiguous, and the reunion just kind of fits better tonally. I don't know, maybe that's an unpopular opinion. But anyway, that should cover just about everything I wanted to say about this game. Ristar's a game I was utterly captivated by when I first played it back on Wii Virtual Console and the Sonic Mega Collection, and it seems that really hasn't worn off. I still love this game, and I would love to see this little star boy show up again in something. The poor sales at the game's original launch did result in any potential franchise plans dying off really quick, and while it has gotten more attention thanks to those re-releases, the most it's landed Ristar is cameos in the Sonic and Sega All-Stars racing games. I would love to see another Ristar game in the future, maybe something by the Sonic Mania team, but given it's been 26 years since the game first came out, I'm finding that unlikely. Then again, several old-school Sega IPs have been getting revivals lately. We live in a world with brand new Wonder Boy games for crying out loud. I bet most of you don't even know what Wonder Boy is. I'm definitely not getting my hopes up for some kind of Ristar revival, but if by some miracle it does end up happening, you bet I'll very likely be on board with it. I don't know, I just want to see more of Ristar. The boy deserves it. With that said, that's all I've got for this time around. This has been Black Mage Benjamin, and until the next video, have a nice day, everybody.